Welcome to our movement building session at the Survivor Summit. We're so honored to have you with us. My name is Nikita Mitchell, she, her pronouns, and I'm the program director at MeToo International. And I'm honored to be here with my co-conspirators, Raya and Shireen, for a powerful session on movement building. For the next 50 minutes, we're going to share our stories of power and resilience, discuss movement and movement building, and highlight ways for all of us to get involved in the fight to end sexual violence. Raya and Shireen, can you all tell us a little bit more about yourselves? Can you share your pronoun, your organization, and how did you join the survivor justice movement?
My name is Raya Steier. My pronouns are they, them, and I am representing Equality Labs. I am an activist. I'm also a lawyer, and I kickstarted the MeToo movement in South Asia in 2017, right when the MeToo movement gained traction in the US with the accusations against Harvey Weinstein. I thought it was a good moment to also kickstart it in other parts of the world where sexual violence and a hostile workplace is commonplace. So that's how I got involved in the survivor justice movement.
Hi, Nikita. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here, an honor to be here with you and me too. I use she, her pronouns. My name's Sheerine Alemzadeh, and I'm the co-founder and co-director of Healing to Action. We are a survivor-led organization based in Chicago, and our mission is to end gender-based violence by building the leadership and collective power of the communities most impacted. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our work later on, but in terms of what got me involved in the survivor justice movement, well, I've been working on this pretty much my whole life, my whole career. I am the daughter, I come from a family of survivors, and I have definitely felt the generational impact of that trauma on my body and on my relationships. And so it's something that's deeply personal to me. It's also just something that from the very beginning gave me life to see how incredibly powerful and resilient that survivors are. They've inspired me in my own personal family and in my in all of the relationships that I have. So that's really how I got here. That's a little bit of the backstory.
Thank you for sharing your story with us, for being vulnerable and open. One of the things that really resonated with me when you were talking was about like being from a family of survivors and being called into the work from the very beginning. Like I too identify as a survivor and have been a part of whether it be racial justice movements or ending police brutality, but there's something about going back to the experience that have shaped my entire life and being like, how do I join a movement, a community that is committed to protecting that little girl inside of me, right? And so super appreciate you sharing that inspiration. And I know that might resonate with a lot of folks here who have joined the summit with us. So we're gonna be talking a lot about movement. We're gonna be using that word. Can you define what is a movement? What is the survivor justice movement? What do we mean when we say that word?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't have a textbook answer. Sorry. One day we can write a textbook about it. But I think for me, it's really about being a survivor is such a personal experience. It's such a personal identity that people hold, and it's also a really lonely one, or has been traditionally a really lonely identity. There's a lot of stigma and shame and blame that's attached to it. And so I think for me, what it means to build a movement for survivor justice is to start to build a collective story and a collective identity around survivorship, and really reclaiming it as a source of power, as a source of transformation, as a source of wisdom in our communities. So I think movement, obviously movement, a lot of times when you think of movements, you think about a huge group of people amassing together to protest or to, hold an institution accountable. And that's definitely one piece of what I think a survivor movement should look like. But there's another piece, which is creating that shared story and starting to really break people out of that isolation and feeling like what happened to them is a result of a personal choice that they made, which so many survivors view experiences of trauma that way, or because of a relationship, or because they didn't get along with somebody, or because of even personal circumstances like personal identity, sort of identities that people hold that might make them feel more vulnerable to violence. All of that is, of course, a part of the story, but the full shared story is so much clearer when you're talking to other survivors, when you're in community with other survivors, when you're sharing these threads that bring together your stories. So I really think for me, movement is about collective identity and storytelling, and using that collective shared identity that's so lacking for so many people into action, moving that into action.
Couldn't have said it better. Absolutely. One of the things that come to mind is 3 years ago when folks said "Me Too." And I remember sitting in front of my computer and seeing people that I've known my entire life say "Me Too." And me being like, wow, wow, I am, even though I understand logically that I'm not alone. I understand logically that what happened to me was not my fault. Well, that took a while to get there, right? But I understand now that it wasn't my fault, that there are larger systems at play that enable sexual violence in our homes and our communities. It really unlocks something when neighbors and friends and family also said, this is my experience too. And we're searching and yearning for connection in a way that silence oftentimes doesn't allow us to do, right? A culture of silence doesn't allow for us to do. And how we take that into action, absolutely. And we've been seeing some beautiful action taking place. We've been seeing folks in movement, organizing, seeking change. And so I would love to hear, like, how has your organization been working to build and advance the movement to end sexual violence? What are some of those victories that y'all have been a part of and inside of?
Yeah, thank you for asking, and thank you for sharing. That was really powerful. So I'm happy to share a little bit more about Healing to Action, a little bit about our history. So we grew out of a coalition of rape crisis centers, worker centers, legal aid organizations, and other allied organizations. We've been working together for about 8 years in this group of allies across Chicago. We started in about 2012, and it was really initially it was really about coming together and addressing the high rates of sexual violence in the workplace, particularly in low-wage workplaces. And we saw this need for more collaboration, particularly across the labor movement and the movement to end sexual violence in Chicago. And so we spent years really hashing out what should this look like, educating each other, working with survivors in both movements to try to figure out a collective vision for moving forward. And what we learned from survivors that we were working with is that what was really missing was a space for survivors, not just to discuss the issues, not just to educate themselves or to gain information or access to resources, but really to build power together. So really trying to develop leadership skills so they could talk about this issue in their communities, create a shared vision for what change could look like, and just really organize towards that change. So setting that vision and then moving into action. So that's how Healing to Action was born. We were founded in 2016 out of this call to action from survivors. And we, at the beginning, at the inception of the organization, we spent over a year talking with survivors from communities that are disproportionately impacted by sexual violence in Chicago. So the communities that we focus on specifically are low income, Black and Brown, Indigenous, immigrant, undocumented, disabled, and LGBTQ survivors. And so those were some of the communities that we were the most involved with from the beginning, to really get their ideas around what leadership should look like and what skills they needed and they identified as necessary to become leaders in their community, to really speak out on these issues. And so we spent about a year meeting with survivors across the city from different neighborhoods, from different workplaces and industries, speaking different languages. And through those conversations and through that work together, we designed our leadership program, Healing Generations, which launched in 2018. And we've now offered that twice, and we have a base of about 30 leaders who come from many of the communities that I just identified, and speak many different languages, and all have really different experiences as survivors. But together they have really built this shared idea and analysis of what causes gender-based violence and what causes sexual violence. And so the Survivor Leadership Program is one piece. We combine healing justice with education about the root causes. So we talk a lot about white supremacy, about capitalism, about other kinds of injustice, to really understand and ground sexual violence in a bigger framework. We also talk to folks about skill building and how they can speak about these issues effectively with people that they love who may disagree with them, how they can safely intervene to support survivors that are experiencing harm, how to receive information, how to receive disclosures from survivors when people that trust them and that they care for tell them that this has happened to them. And then the last piece is that we actually work to design campaigns that our leaders work on. They decide what they want to work on based on their experiences and their wisdom and understanding of what is causing sexual violence in their communities based on their experiences. So our first leadership cohort actually launched a campaign. It's been going for about a year and a half now. It's called Sex Ed Works. And they had a whole conversation in the leadership program about how they were learning about a lot of concepts like consent and healthy relationships and what that means for the first time as adults in this program, and that they didn't have access to sexual health education, and they felt like if they had, maybe this would not have happened to them, and they wanted to make sure that their children received access to that education. And they learned after talking with their kids that they weren't receiving this education at all in school, even though there is a mandatory comprehensive sexual health education policy in Chicago, and schools are supposed to be teaching it. So we did a lot of digging and research, and really launched this campaign publicly last year to start to try to ensure that the school district was going to be offering the access to this really important critical education to students, particularly in the communities that are hardest hit by sexual violence, the communities that our leaders were coming from, that have been underinvested or disinvested in from many different institutions in our city. So that is the Sex Ed Works campaign. And it's really just one example of the magic that can happen when survivors have a space for their vision, have a space for their ideas, and there aren't just decisions that are being made for them. Through the campaign, our leaders have been able to hold people in power accountable. They've met with school board leaders. They have held town halls. They've written letters. They are, talking with people in their community. They've reached over 250 community members through organizing, community meetings and teach-ins and listening sessions. They've been partnering with the Chicago Teachers Union. So this is just one small example about what survivor-led organizing can look like. And I think what we really feel proud about with our organizing work at Healing to Action is that it's really being led by the hearts and the minds and the desires of survivors. So in that way, we see our work as really giving power back so that people can really self-determine their futures and build the world they want to see, and use their experiences of survival as a key building block to do that.
Thank you for sharing all of those amazing victories that have come from the desires and yearnings of survivors. One of the things that you named that I'm sitting with is this concept of power and leadership, right? And so for some of us, those concepts of having agency, having voice, being able to determine what you want, what you need, what you don't want, being able to say no and yes, all of those concepts for some of us have been a struggle to lean into, a struggle to believe, that you have power, and that you should determine what's best for you and your community. And so it's really interesting to hear you talk about the work and how power and leadership and consent is key to the work that y'all are doing and building power for the work towards the world that y'all want to build. And so very beautiful to like hear that come out of y'all's work. The thing that I'm super curious about is you keep talking about vision, right? And we know that vision is critical for movements, because a vision is what we aspire to. It is what holds us and grounds us when it gets hard, when we believe it's not possible, right? Vision allows for us to come back to what we desire. And so I'm really curious about, from you all's perspective and at Healing to Action, but also just in general in terms of the survivor justice movement, what would that world look like without sexual violence? What would exist in our communities and in our homes? What are we fighting for, Shireen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, everyone, it is a collective question. So I can't speak for the entire movement, but I can share my own sort of thoughts and my vision. And I think we do spend a lot of time at Healing to Action visioning together, because part of the work really requires radical imagination, and really thinking about a future that's bold, ambitious, and really difficult to really envision, when there's the root causes of sexual violence are so deeply embedded in our culture and our society. So it can be really hard to break past that. And sometimes people can feel hopeless about, like, why am I even thinking about this? But it is the energizing force, and if you're not thinking big and bold, then what are you really doing? Why are you in this work? The work is too hard not to have a big, bold vision behind it. But for me, I think that when I think about what sexual violence is, I think about it as a tool to police people and to enforce conformity and to enforce certain behaviors based on assumptions that people have about each other when they're in the womb, before they're even born. Assumptions about who they should love, what they should wear, how they should act, what kind of work they should do, what kind of sex they should have, all of this, right? And so for me, really, what a world free from sexual violence is a world that is so much bigger and freer for people to come with so many more options at their disposal, where they can be their freest and their most authentic selves, that they can make these choices without this threat of violence that is hanging over them all the time, if they choose to step out of line, if they choose to break out of the box of conformity. And so to me, it's a world where kids can play with whatever toys they want to play with, where people can be in relationships with whoever they love and is meaningful to them, that people can set a vision for their future and how they're going to bring meaning into their lives that isn't constrained by expectations that are grounded in things like their sex organs or their sex assigned at birth. And it's a world that just feels like the air is clearer, and the sun is brighter, and everything is just more possible. The things that are so meaningful to us, the relationships that we hold, the work that gives us joy, the family that gives us meaning, the community that we care about, all of that becomes more accessible to us and more open to us.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for sharing your vision around what the world and what our communities need to look like in order to not exist under sexual violence and patriarchal violence. Raya, I would love to pass it to you to answer the same question. What does the world look like without sexual violence? What would need to exist to make that possible?
I think we need to end the culture of impunity that exists in our society. So in South Asia, where I did most of my gender justice work, there is a deep culture of impunity that perpetrators and harm doers enjoy, and that is reinforced through the courts, and it's reinforced through the family, and it's reinforced through like our neighbors and our society in general. And a world without sexual violence would make sure that that doesn't exist, that culture of impunity is dismantled, and that we try to create safe spaces for ourselves in small like bubbles. But in an ideal world, every place should be a safe space for women, for non-men, for queer people. It should be a safe space no matter where we go, and we don't have to create one in our like private spaces.
Yeah, agree, agree. The ways in which culture and societal systems enable, support, endorse sexual violence must be uprooted in order for us to have a world where that doesn't exist. The question or the thing that's coming up for me is a question of deserving, right? We as survivors deserve the world that y'all just named. We deserve a world that doesn't doesn't stand up around sexual, that doesn't isn't built on patriarchal violence, right? We deserve a world where there's access to justice and accountability that's transformative. And we also deserve healing throughout. Yeah. And hopefully throughout the summit, folks are receiving the permission to dream of that world, right? Giving yourself that permission to have a radical imagination and believe just a little bit more that it's possible to get to that world. The other thing that's coming to mind, and Shireen, you talked about this a little bit, which is that sexual violence is a form of control and domination, right? Both culturally and societal structures. And in this moment, we're also talking about control and domination of another type, which is police violence, right? The criminal justice system, the immigration system, the ways in which our bodies are being impacted by state-based terror. And so the question that comes to mind for me is, how does that relate to the survivor justice movement? And so if y'all don't mind answering, and Raya, I'll pass it to you first. If we understand that survivors are everywhere, that oftentimes we're also survivors of other forms of oppression, whether it be caste oppression, whether it be police brutality, racism, poverty, homophobia, transphobia. If we also understand that there are movements that do work in those areas, can you share why might it be important for other movements to know about and center the needs of survivors of sexual violence? And what might that look like in practice?
I think that when it comes to police violence or caste atrocities that impact my community, for example, and my community is also really impacted by police killings, and I believe that they people who like are impacted by these atrocities are survivors in the end of the day. And sexual violence, those who go through sexual violence are also survivors of this control. that people in power try to assert over you to perpetuate, patriarchy or any other form of like oppression that is systemic. So I feel that survivors in general need to link up regardless of what the type of oppression was. So survivors of police brutality and survivors of sexual violence do have things in common in that we're trying to dismantle these systems that perpetuate this kind of harm on survivors and create survivors in the first place. So I think it's important to center survivors of gender justice in conversations about police brutality, because often the police also assault, there are a lot of custodial sexual violence and sexual violence in prisons. So I think it is very pertinent to discuss that aspect of violence when we talk about police brutality or any other kind of violence. Um, the sexual violence is always an aspect of control, even in different other types of brutalities that take place. So I think it's important to center that.
Absolutely. Shireen, anything you would add?
I think Raya summed it up very well. I think that, the other piece around why it's important to, and I would even go so far to say hold other movements accountable to the desires and the needs of survivors, is because the solutions without the voices of survivors simply don't respond to their realities. So just an example to the point of police brutality is, when I've asked survivors within our membership base, people have very different opinions about whether the police are helpful in situations of trauma and harm that are happening based on their experiences with the police, based on their communities, their identities, their lived experiences. And so I think that it's both, it's kind of goes both ways, because one, you need to hold other social justice movements accountable. So one example I can give there is that Healing to Action works a lot with the economic justice and labor movement. And we will do trainings all the time. We've done trainings with unions and worker centers and labor alliances across the country where the leadership doesn't necessarily know that this is an issue, and you go and start talking about it, and almost everybody in the room starts to share that this is something that's happened to them, and also share that they didn't know that this was a place that was for sharing this kind of thing, and that this is not an institution that is where they felt safe talking about it. And so how do we create the conditions where our institutions, our social movement organizations are responding to what survivors are wanting and needing for them to do? Because as you said so beautifully, Nikita, survivors are everywhere, so it's not about responding to the needs, it's recognizing that survivors are you. It's your organization. You are working, you owe survivors because they are doing so much work for you to advance your goals. But with respect, just one last thought, with respect to the issues around police violence and police brutality, I think, it was really powerful to have a group of survivors together sharing the very different experiences that they had with police. We had survivors from some of Chicago's neighborhoods where there's very heavy police presence, talking about how police are just not trained to deal with mental health trauma that a lot of people in their communities were dealing with, and that they didn't have those resources. And so police were creating more violence and harm as a result of their presence in their communities. While other survivors with disabilities were talking about how police intervention and interpersonal violence can often lead to institutionalization, where they're being put into institutions. And then undocumented survivors talking about how they felt like the police didn't understand the family situations that they were in, and were responding in really culturally insensitive ways to some of the issues that they were raising. But to have everyone together in that room and saying, look, this is my experience, this is my story. It was really, really powerful for people to hear from one another, so they could really start to deconstruct what the police means in a much more in-depth, kind of nuanced way than they would have been able to if they didn't have that space to build relationships and share stories together.
So we talked about what a movement is. We talked about what the visions are of survivors, our own visions, and why we think that that's important. A movement is built on the power and the leadership and the collective brilliance of survivors, right? At least this particular movement, that it takes all of us. Yeah, it will take all of us. And so I'm curious, what would you all share as one way for folks attending this summit? How can they join the movement to end sexual violence? If they're committed, if they care about this work, how can they show up?
I think those who are interested in helping, you know, who are interested in taking this movement forward and building this movement, I think it's important for them to join organizations and people who are already doing this work and offering their services and help to these organizations and people doing this work already, and kind of helping them build capacity to grow. I think it's, there are already people doing this work, and it's really important to support them and to learn from them and to kind of spread what they're doing elsewhere and to build capacity. So I think it's really important for people who are interested in doing this kind of work um, to kind of work with them, work with the people already doing this work, and kind of building on that. I think it's really important for us to kind of take what is already there and then build on that.
Yeah, and I would say, to Raya's point, I think also that people who are, if you're watching, you've already taken one step, and these are organizations. We're very grateful to be a part of this summit, and we're very grateful to the organizers. And these are all organizations that you should check out, because the purpose for our existence is to support survivors, to lift up their experiences and voices. So I can share, for Healing to Action, just you can follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, healingtoaction.org. I know that you all might want to also share some of your information, but I think, for what it's really not about, I think one of the things, as we talked about earlier, Nikita, was this idea that it's such big, like ambitious kind of goals that we have, that it can feel like you can feel paralyzed or you can feel like frozen into action, because it's just such a big and lofty goal. But like just doing things like showing up, you should feel proud of doing that, and also being really confident and secure in your experience and the wisdom and power that you bring to this, that your voice is so important, your presence is so important. And so in the small and large ways that you can get involved in this work, feel very good about doing it, and know that you have our support and our admiration for doing it.
I think the thing that's coming up for me from both of what y'all have said is, if you have taken the time to register for this event, to watch this session, to be in your healing journey, to sit when you get triggered or feel fear, to lean into joy and laughter, you are a part of this movement to end sexual violence. You are a part of this community that is committed to ensuring that we're in a world where this is not our future. And so I was deeply grateful for you all's commitment and you all's joining in of this movement. Want to also share, we are building a survivor's agenda. And so you can also join this community as well, whether it be looking at the agenda, sharing your agenda with us at survivorsagenda.org, following up with amazing organizations that have been in this session, whether it be Healing to Action, Equality Labs, or other organizations throughout the summit, or just being in community in your own home, in your own family, with yourself in terms of your story. So thank you so much. We appreciate you being with us for the last hour, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikita. Thank you.